Okay, so Dominic, how did you first, I suppose, hear of magic, get into magic, or even did you call it magic when you first started on this path?
So I would say I was probably into magic before I even knew what magic was, by virtue of being like training in Aikido, for example. I've been training in Aikido for 9 years. And then I started getting into Qigong as like a supplemental practice for like health and wellness and physical capacity. So, you're doing all these visualizations and breathing techniques, but I wasn't necessarily into magic per se. But as a kid, I always had like magical inclinations, like enchantment and nature and whatnot. But it wasn't until I started getting into meditation practice, and then with the aim to pursue awakening, a Buddhist awakening, and really hitting meditation hard. And then all of a sudden the lid blew off, and then magic became really obviously a thing. So then, as we do these days, just went on the internet, on Reddit, and just going down the many rabbit holes. So
so like when you said then as a child that you're doing kind of enchantments and going to the was forests and stuff, what did that look like? What exactly was going on now?
Well, I mean, so I meant like having a sense of enchantment rather than doing enchantment. So it's like
so you weren't going to the forest and making voodoo dolls or doing anything like that?
Not quite yet, but although I do remember when my mom got remarried as a kid and we moved out into the country in New York, she had like this one occult book that was like from the 70s or 60s or something, and I don't remember what the title is, but it had like a sigil on the front that was like green and blue and yellow, looked scary as fuck. So I was like, so like it was like one of those things where the book exudes like this aura, and I was like kind of afraid to look at it. But I remember like my dad would take me, like we would drive out to Barnes and Noble because at that time there wasn't one close by, and I remember like seeing all these spooky books, and I was always like too afraid to look at it, but I still felt like the draw to it, which was funny. But
what sort of what like climate were you in? Like, what were your parents? Were they religious, not religious, atheists? Were they?
Well, my parents were raised Catholic, but they never. We basically went to church a handful of times as a kid, and they didn't really push anything on me at all. It was very non-religious, but so it was super chill environment in that regard.
But were they open to like kind of weird ideas, or was it just a non-issue? Like it just wasn't.
Not really. Yeah, I mean, my parents aren't that strange or into weird stuff. Like they weren't like into the Theosophical Society or anything, but like they've always been really open-minded and supportive. So that was like whatever weird shit I did as a teen and there onwards, they didn't really bat an eye.
So was there any kind of contemporaries that you had at school or anything that were like, was there anyone who was mad into Aleister Crowley or anything like that? Or was it, all just fairly...
No, as a kid, it was like, like I hung out with like, like the skater crowd. So like it was, amongst others. So like everybody was like into heavy metal and but I actually never had any exposure to like Aleister Crowley or any of the other big, well-known magical people, even for like the edgelord. We're going to read these books because we're naughty and we smoke cigarettes under the bleachers or what have you. But I did play Magic the Gathering a bit.
All right, okay.
so that's what comes to mind. But yeah, it wasn't really until much later, and I think a lot of it has to do with like the time that we're in, and like when all the new atheists came out, like there's a fairly dominant, like 9/11 happened, and it's like just atheism was like really dominant in like my social sphere and exposure.
Yeah. No, I totally get it, because mine like was absolutely dissimilar. Like at one point it just felt like everyone was like this kind of militant atheist, and then there was me going hello. Although so you kind of felt that you couldn't talk about it, I suppose, a bit, or not that you couldn't talk about it, you just didn't want to, because you knew what the answer was.
Yeah, and I just sort of felt like like I think what ends up happening is that as a child, like that unconditioned like sense of wonder, or like whatever people claim is like the consciousness of a child that's like fresher or more in touch with the divine or the magical qualities of reality, you know, like as you grow older, that sort of gets conditioned out. Like you have to become, you know, a productive member of society, and you can't entertain all these, like, you know,
you have to grow up and stop having childish ideas and this kind of thing.
Like religion is the opiate of the masses and stuff, that sort of thing. But I don't think it's any coincidence then, like, eventually, like, you know, always loving art, music, poetry, literature, you know, like still being in touch with like a sense of wonder that is magical, like especially poetry. Like my relationship to poetry is much different than it used to be. Like, oh, this is artistic and beautiful, but you know, like the magician, you know, speaks poetry as enchantment, you know, incantation. So
spells,
exactly.
So then what would have been the first initial, I suppose, calling of the silent knowing, if you want to speak in Magia terms, but like what was the first reason to go looking for something that wasn't the world as it was presented? You know, what was your kind of neo moment where you realized that there was a splinter in your brain?
Yeah, so it was like 2015 and 2016. You know, as I was in I was in a former relationship, and things started to get very contracted. Like there was like, you know, coming to these impasses, and at one point, like, you know, there was issues in our relationship, and then my partner proposed to me at the time, but then like I was like, no, like this is not the right course of action. And even though I love that person very much and I really wanted to work it out, and that was like around 2016. Okay. And then at some point, like I just was super depressed. I became like very, very, very depressed. And I was like, you know, for me, like I've never like entertained like suicidal ideation or anything, but there was a point where I was just like, if I could just stop existing, like that would be awesome. Cause like
was it like, if I don't wake up in the morning, I'm kind of okay with that, but I'm not going to do anything about it, sort of thing.
Totally. Like it could be like cryogenic stasis for like, you know, a decade or so, and be okay with that. And so, but there was a part of me that was like, well, I know in the past that like, you know, it brings up childhood again. Like, you know, that earlier in my life, there was times where I was happy, and that this was wrong. It was wrong to feel this way, this darkness, this grayness. And so at that point, I just sort of had in my mind that like, it was just like some sort of intuition that I was like, I'm going to find the answer. And so then I basically started going on Reddit, looking at the meditation subreddit, and then through that, started hearing about this thing called the progressive insight, which is, you know, a Theravadan map in Buddhism. And, you know, and then there's this group of people that were like, oh, you can become awakened. It's not like this fantasy. Like you could actually do this in your life.
In your lifetime, yeah. It's not 500 lifetimes and all this, yeah. Yeah. That seems a pretty big jump, though, from feeling depressed to getting on Reddit and then to suddenly finding this. Like, had you an awareness of meditation before that? Any sort of a practice, or did you just find yourself in the deep end, literally, I suppose?
Oh, so I mean, over the years, like I would say, like, you know, yoga, when yoga became a thing, you know, just trying yoga for a little bit, and then like, you know, mindfulness started becoming really popular in the public, you know, in the mid 2000s, and you know, that's obviously, it's starting to wane quite a bit now. If you go to the supermarket or whatever, you don't see as many publications, but you know, knowing about mindfulness, and then because of Aikido, like knowing about like the somatic practices and breath meditations and Qigong, and, you know, and then, you know, just never really doing yoga that seriously, never doing like mindfulness. You know, I would do like 10 or 15 minutes like every once in a while, and I was like, okay, I can get some sort of space, and it just never really seemed, I just never knew what it could be. I just sort of took it at face value, like, oh, like you can be calmer, you can be happier, you can be, you know, a little more chill. So then, you know, I started practicing Qigong and starting to notice a lot of interesting stuff happening, but nothing too crazy, just like energetic stuff, you know. And that was in my wheelhouse because of Aikido training.
Sure. Yeah.
And then from then I started to, because of Reddit, you know, started to read the Zen subreddit, which is known as for being a garbage dump, but it was still super
well, I mean, you could say that about all of Reddit, in fairness. You know, it's a bit of it's an interesting place, I suppose.
Yeah, and it's been so instrumental for me in a lot of ways, but it's unpalatable at this point in a lot of regards. But so then I started reading a lot of the, you know, the Chinese Zen masters, and then it sort of fed into learning about like these old Buddhist maps. And so yeah, there was definitely context around it. And
so like what was your meditation practice look like when you get on, you know, you started getting to this where you know, did you go 20 minutes a day? Was it like straight into 10 hours a day? Were you going on, you know, 20-day silent retreats, or, you know, was it more of a slow kind of gradual getting into it?
No, it was like, because I was living through such a, like, it just felt intolerable for like a little while, like for such a long time, that like there was this part of me that was like, no. And so basically I just jumped into it. Around that time when I started learning about pragmatic Dharma, a book called The Mind Illuminated had come out at the time. And it was,
yeah.
So basically it was perfect because it was like, not only is awakening in this lifetime possible, but here's this book that you can go through stages, and there's like specific things to focus on and specific drills. And this is when, you know, you're able to move on to the next stage. And so it was like a very clear training program that was allowing me to really plug into something without like a very strong container that would allow me to develop the discipline to support a practice that really quickly became like an hour a day at least. So initially it started off, I was like doing 30 minutes to 45 minutes. And then eventually, because like, I was like, I don't give a shit about anything else right now. It felt so urgent and so important to actually respond to the call to do this, which in hindsight is just sort of like, well, why did I have so much faith that this would be the thing?
That, like, it is an interesting, you know, like, because usually in kind of those places, the dark places, whatever, there's the hard bit is to get kind of have this trusting or this faith or something like that. But it seems to have been, I don't know, was it just that it was out of necessity that he says, I have to trust that at least something will work? Or was it more in knowing that this was the way out of the darkness? So at some deep kind of level.
Yeah, I saw it as an answer, because I was sort of like, well, something is wrong in me, with me, like in how I'm relating to my life in this relationship. And then we ended up separating. So it ended up taking a different course than I expected. But I was like, when I look back in retrospect, I sort of see like taking on this specific style of practice as a magical act, because in the book, there's a framework. It's like a 6-step process. Like you sit down, you state your intention, why you're doing this, what you're hoping to accomplish. There's like a variety of different details that you sort of align yourself with.
Yeah.
So basically it's like, oh, I'm setting this intention. So my intention would be like, it was very prayerful too. I'd be like, I'm doing this so that I could, you know, like repair my relationship and awaken and like be of a benefit to all beings. You know, it was like very intense. And so I felt like the energy of that really carried me through. So I didn't really encounter a lot, like I feel very fortunate because I didn't really encounter a lot of the frustrations of practice that a lot of people encounter. Like it's boring, or like my mind's not quiet. And then they see that as the marker of success, is like pure quiet, when like that's not really what it's all about.
But I think that it's kind of the Google mindfulness thing that came out kind of, I think that's where an awful lot that mistake came from, that people assumed that you had to have this quiet mind. And I go, I can't meditate because I have too many thoughts. And they go, yes, yes, you do. That's the point. But what the actual meditation thing is realizing that you've all these thoughts, like, and that's the thing that's pointed at.
and you're like, you've just sort of like, you've just decided you would turn down the volume knob on all this stuff that's shouting at you in the other room. And then meditation is just like, oh, having some sense of what's actually going on. So because of the energy that I had and was just thrown into with practice and, you know, really believing in it, it started to get weird really quickly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Define weird.
So what became, you know, so I was practicing the Mind Illuminated, which is a shamatha and vipassana system, but then I would incorporate a lot of metta because I felt like, because my heart felt so dry and not alive, I would incorporate the Mind Illuminated, and I would do metta, and then I would do.
I take it might be helpful to explain those terms to people who probably don't, you know, wouldn't be too familiar with them, because it's more like.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, so if you could, or at least your understanding of what they are, like metta, for instance, which is the love and kindness, like kind of, or whatever.
So shamatha is referred to as calm abiding, concentration practice, which a lot of people as time have gone on have contested because it like implies like this laser focus. But reality, I think it's more helpful to think of it as a settling, like the mind starts to settle. And that's usually done like through breath meditation, like you're breathing in, breathing out, and then the mind starts to quiet, and then you get into more absorption states that are pleasant, peaceful, enjoyable. And then vipassana is translated as like insight practice, which is like the looking. You're looking at what the mind is doing. So there's a whole list of different ways this is done. Metta is loving kindness. So this is, I see it as a prayer, you know, like you basically say like, may the world, you know, may I be well, may I be at ease, may I be peaceful. You know, even though a lot of times people have a very dry relationship to metta, eventually it starts to lubricate and become joyful. And that's how you start to cultivate like the positive mind states of love and kindness.
Particularly when you start expressing it towards people you dislike or have trouble with or that kind of thing. And it starts as being hard to do, and then you realize it's less hard to do. You know, that's kind of, at least that's how I found it anyway.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, a lot of times, you know, it depends. Like teachers will often tell students who are struggling with this, they have to try different things. Like, so maybe like it's hard. Like sometimes people find it really easy to express that to other people, even if they don't like those people, but they have trouble expressing it towards themselves.
Yes.
Or if they have like a family member that they don't like, that's super triggering and they can't do that. Or some people, they'll just be like, you should do it with your pet, you know, think of your pet, because a lot of times people can contrive a strong sense of love and appreciation for their pet. So,
so when you were saying you were combining these things, was it in the sense of in the same practice, like you were breaking up your hour or half hour what you're doing into, I would start, you know, and then I would go into vipassana or go into some sort of noting technique and end with metta? Or was it like today I'm doing metta, tomorrow I'm doing noting practice? Or
so basically what I would do is I would usually spend like 20 minutes or so doing the metta practice to sort of quiet everything down. And then I would do the Mind Illuminated for 40 to 50 minutes.
Okay.
Because it's the shamatha heavy focus, like it's easy to like kind of smooth that out. And then usually at the end, I would do 10 to 20 minutes of the noting practice.
Okay.
And since I didn't define that, it's basically just whenever something arises in your awareness, you note it. So if, you know, itchy butt or, you know, I'm drowsy, you know, you just rapidly just noticing whatever ache in the back, you know, pleasant sensation in the heart, you know, and then just indiscriminately just cycling through those until stuff happens. So I basically, my attitude was like, well, a lot of people online are like, well, you shouldn't mix practices. So what I did was like, I'll just treat each practice of a technique as a discrete practice period, and then just add them all together. So this ended up becoming up to 2 hours, right? But
oh wow,
so it would be super enjoyable though, because then like it would sort of, you know, like these things would link together, and then clearly I could trust the fact that what I was doing was working because it was really obviously so.
Right. Yeah, because you said it got weird quick. So what did you start finding? What was the weirdness?
So, in the progress of insight, it tracks different points that you will encounter, and at some point it gets this rough patch, allegedly. So, this is often referred to as the dark night of the soul, which isn't, there's like some cross-cultural mixing going on there because that term wasn't found within Buddhism, but this is the dukkha yana. So basically it would be like disgust, misery, there's all these different ones that sound pretty terrible. But what I noticed when this was encountering me, because I was so depressed, in contrast, when I was encountering these things in practice, which became pretty evident to me, like it was actually pretty novel. It ended up being rather psychedelic at times.
Okay.
So like I remember I would see stuff vibrating, and I would see I would see various images and shadows, and I would smell things that weren't there. Like there was just no reason that there was no accounting for a certain smell that I would have.
Pleasant and unpleasant, would you spell was it pleasant and unpleasant?
Oh no, it was just purely unpleasant.
Right, okay.
So it was like during disgust. I remember it smelled like rotting corpses.
Oh no!
Like that.
Oh no!
So it was just stuff that was like super weird because I'd be sitting in my room or whatever, and like there was no accounting for that. And then also like I remember like hearing like a variety of different tones layered upon each other. So I'd hear like 4 or 5 different distinct tones.
Okay.
And it was super eerie.
Right. And was this all happen within the practice? Was there anything happening like in your day-to-day life that was kind of equally weird?
It was happening in both.
Both,
so,
right, okay, yeah.
So like it would happen, like I would be at work and then I would hear these eerie tones, and it was like, oh, this is like, it was kind of sinister, but it was so unusual. I wasn't actually afraid of it. So, you can imagine if people were like, oh, I'm going to do mindfulness-based stress reduction, and then all of a sudden they get thrown into like this place. They're like, what the hell is going on with me? And then it gets potentially misdiagnosed as some sort of psychological pathology, when in reality, like, it's this thing that happens.
Yeah. Or if they come from some sort of like cultural background or like a religious background that makes them believe, oh, the devil's coming for me, or any of these things, it can be, That's why I think it's important to have stuff like the Mind Illuminated, or even Daniel Ingram's book, which, gives out the stages. This is going to happen when you do this. Be prepared.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's good to have the information despite the drawbacks that are obvious, but you can't avoid, misinterpretation, misutilization of these things. Like, for better or worse, it's out. So I was very actually happy for those things, because it illustrated that this was real and that what I was experiencing was normal. So there was one point, like at work, like the specific day I still remember very vividly, where I was hearing these tones, and then all of a sudden I had this sense of looking at my hand and just feeling like I actually wasn't in control of my body.
Oh, wow.
That the whole thing was being automatically run. Like my total experience was automatic, and I was just along. I had this sense that I was merely along for the ride. And it was so viscerally terrifying and simultaneously amazing that it felt like I was like, holy shit, like this whole thing is happening without my input. So stuff like that was like really disorienting, but also like reminded me of experiences with psychedelics, just sort of like these moments that are like very reminiscent of the ebb and flow of a psychedelic trip. And so it just kept gaining steam, which was pretty awesome.
So I assume then at some point there was some sort of, kind of, I suppose, pinnacle or senate to this kind of working. That was there some sort of awakening or some sort of sudden satori or something at that point? Or was it just like a constant unfoldment, or how was it going?
Yeah, I mean, I would say in retro, like in the grand scheme of things, there's definitely an unfoldment, but it just was very predictable. And so I actually have a theory too, because a lot of times like people talk about this issue of scripting. So like they read a map and then they sort of project that experience onto what's happening. And but then what I started to like interpret that as like, oh, like actually that could actually be magical reinforcement. So like you get exposed to this idea, and then all of a sudden, because you treat it seriously, it starts to materialize in your experience. And because you're plugging into a specific tradition by way of specific practices, you're sort of aligning yourself with the life force of that tradition. And so I actually never really cared whether or not it was scripted, because it was very real and happening. But essentially, like, there's the description of cessation, which is like the blinking out of experience. And it's like, it sort of is like if you pulled out the plug on your monitor and then it's just like, you know, it's like, and then like everything disappears and it flicks. And that happens like in all your sense spheres. So you're like, oh, that's obviously very weird, but it's also very, it was very understated. Like, but then
that sounds like something that could never be understated. Like you go, oh, right, that was.
But if you imagine, like, if your lights flashed off in your apartment, right? Like if it was dead, like if it was dead quiet in your house, like in the middle of the night, and you were watching TV, and if like for a split second it came off and came on again, you would be like, oh, that was weird, but whatever. So it's sort of like that. Right. But then it's accompanied by like peacefulness and positive mind states. You know, this. And so it was interesting because in the relationship, things were getting increasingly tense, because I think, you know, despite the fact that my partner was into weird stuff as well, they were like, hey, we have to like build careers and make something of ourselves and, you know, have extra money. It seemed like my basically going in the opposite direction to take care of my own well-being was putting on a lot of tension. So I would be experiencing like a lot of equanimity or whatever, which, you know, could end up becoming spiritual bypassing, because you sort of enter into equanimity to avoid your issues, you know, which is a problem.
Yes. Yeah.
But I just remember being like, oh, well, I have a lot more peacefulness and clarity, which was really beneficial. So that was basically the start of stuff getting weird.
Right. That was just the beginning.
That was just the beginning. Yeah. So
was it the realization, I suppose, then that you were getting these insights, or whatever word we want to put to it, but it wasn't fixing the problem that you started the practice for, which is your relationship wasn't getting any better in this, what seems to be, or it wasn't, I suppose, you know, you're getting, in a sense, a bit of the opposite of what you were looking for. You know, you were getting pulled away, further away from it, in a sense. Would I be right in saying that at that point?
I would say so. Basically, like within this specific Theravadan map, there's four paths is how they break it up, and all these different maps have they define specific levels and stages with specific qualities. So basically for me it was like, oh well, if this is what I think it is, it would be first path. There was all these other ones to go, so there was still like the carrot dangling in front of me.
Okay.
And so basically there was so much interest. And I was like, well, I want more of this good stuff. So I remember at like one point, like I was like experiencing the levels of joyfulness that like being on psychedelics, like looking, like I remember one time I was in the shower and I was like washing my hair, and then I looked at my hands and it was very soapy. And I was like remembering looking at the bubbles and being like, holy shit, this is amazing. Like, and just like reality is so awesome. So basically for me, I was like, there's no other game in town, baby. I was like, let's just do this meditation thing. Yeah. And that became the primary concern that I had. So that's the quality. I just felt like I was being drawn forward into something awesome. So it continued to get better and better. You know, it continues to get better and better.
And how was your life then at that point? How was that reflecting? Were you becoming more kind of introverted, I suppose, or like were you pulling away from life, or was your life continuing on as normal? Like if you're doing 2 hours of meditation today and getting weirdness at work, there has to be, I suppose, some sort of effect to it.
So what ended up happening was, I had a really good group of friends that are locally that we would support each other. So my social life was still very active. So we would hang out and practice together, and we would meet up several times a week, practice together. So I had all of a sudden, like, a new group of friends became very strong and very prominent. And so that was very supportive. A lot of times, like, when you see people online, they don't really have that level of support. And so a lot of it for me is because we were all doing this together, I actually attribute a lot of my success to this group of friends because, when you mutually practice and, you normalize things that are weird, I felt very supported. And then I also had a lot of really strong friendships. So I actually didn't become more introverted despite the fact I was spending so much time practicing. It just ended up taking the place of time that I would spend on other things like video games or reading or whatever. So that basically just got replaced. But what was my life then? From then on, it got wacky because all of a sudden, like, because the depression started to dissipate, that in that regard, I accomplished what I wanted to do.
Right. Yes.
Depression eradicated. Like, from that point, like, it was gone. Because I was on SSRIs, and at one point we went on a retreat, and I forgot my SSRIs, and I was like, "I'm done taking these." Yeah. I went on retreat. That was the second time I experienced what I interpret as second path within the system. But there was like a magical influence on why that happened as well, which we can get into in a moment. But yeah, I was like, yes, I'm not depressed anymore. The life with my reality was really vibrant and very lively. So at that point, I had a lot more energy. So I was actually, things got pretty intense because I sort of felt so happy. I had like a devil may care attitude. So for a while, I was like, I'm just going to run around and do whatever I want. So we ended up separating and stuff. And so then I lived on my own, and at that point, like, I was an editor for a local poetry press. So at that point I was like, yes, my life is mine again, Okay. So,
like literally a whole new lease on life, like that kind of, is that how it felt? Yeah.
Exactly. It exactly felt like a new lease on life. And so even though I didn't know how it was going to unfold, and I was still very sad, and, don't get me wrong, like, I still had outbursts and stuff, like when we were breaking up, and it was still like, very painful experience for a long, long time, but still I had this new lease on life and this new appreciation and got what I was looking for at the time. So there would be a lot more points in which there would be a lot of striving and angst about the path and the spiritual path and practice. But for that point, it was quite amazing.
Right. Was it like when you were doing this at this time, were you working under a particular teacher, or was it all kind of self-driven or group-driven, or, what kind of, or were you just kind of letting the practice be the teacher kind of a thing?
So there was a lot of levels of support. So basically, like, I felt pretty confident in my ability to be honest when I was reading The Mind Illuminated, gauging, because it's easy to like inflate like your practice. You're like, oh, I want to move on to this stage, but you're not really moving anywhere, so it's pointless. So I felt pretty honest with myself in terms of like, okay, the book is really well written and well detailed. So like, on one level, I was honest with myself with where I was at. Two, I had this group of friends. So like, in the spirit of pragmatic Dharma, there's a lot of like peer-based support networks. Plus, I had a teacher who was a close student of Chuladasa, the author of The Mind Illuminated. Basically, I saw, like, we were close for a while, and basically he helped me to stream entry first path. Okay. And then at that point, I didn't really feel like I needed him as a teacher anymore. So I had a variety of support groups.
Right. So you mentioned there that you had a magical influence on your on a retreat. This the one where you forgot your antidepressants. Was that kind of more when the kind of magic started coming in, or is that again in hindsight that you're aware that there was a magical influence? Like,
No, absolutely. It became a lot more explicit. So at this point, what I started encountering online is because I had this influx of energy, and just like there's like like with the relationship stuff, like there's like matters of concerns and contemplating like sexuality and romance and love, and just like what I was noticing on Reddit, for example, at the time, and that's changed, of course, so it's not meant to be defining the specific subreddit called Stream Entry, is that people weren't really in touch with Eros. They weren't really that comfortable with sexuality. So a lot of the vestigial attitudes of Theravada Buddhism, the renunciate attitude and orientation, despite being practiced by modern people on Reddit, it just wasn't very supportive in that regard. And I didn't want them to be like, oh, like you have to like eradicate lust. You have to, contemplate the corpse. Like there's all these different exercises that are supposed to reduce the strength of lust so you can operate,
pure
positively. So I was like, like you guys don't seem very sophisticated in this realm. So I started to become very angsty in that way, know. So I started to learn about other traditions in Buddhism, which I didn't know about at all. And so then I started becoming more familiar with Tibetan Buddhism and Vajrayana. And so there's a specific practice called deity yoga. That I was like, I was very intrigued by what deity yoga is. And for those who don't know what deity yoga is, basically in Vajrayana Buddhism, there's a whole pantheon of gods and goddesses and bodhisattvas who live in an imaginal realm, a Buddha realm. And basically like they sort of reflect ourselves and our constitutions and our attitudes, our personalities. So like if you're peaceful, if you're wrathful, if you're more intellectual, if you're more heart oriented, there's a Buddha for you. And so basically you have to go through a ritual traditionally in Vajrayana to get permission to practice with specific Buddhas. So it's more like, it's like a formal ritual, magical ritual where you are given, it's like an introduction. You're like, hey, we're going to do this. You now have permission to practice with this Buddha. But because at the time, there's a lot of requirements generally. So I was like, well, I want to just try this practice anyway. So I started learning about this teacher. His name is Rob Burbea, and he has a whole body of teaching called the Imaginal Teaching. And he is also called Soul Making. So basically what this is, it's sort of like in magical terms, it's like vision work or, journeying, basically like going into deep meditation and then sort of evoking whoever you want, like specific figures. Like, so you could do your favorite musician or a writer that you like, and you just sort of let it surface. You like let this interaction with whichever figure you want surface, or you imagine any number of things. Like I have wings, and what's it like to have wings? So
it's like essentially active imagination, Jung's type thing, like that. That's
exactly. And so Rob Burbea was really into James Hillman. So that influence is sort of filtered through his Buddhist work, and so he started becoming into more Western stuff. So I was like, screw it, I'm just going to do deity yoga and just using Rob Burbea's teaching as sort of like a template. And I just had a very playful attitude, a very like artistic attitude, where I imagined myself as a specific Buddha, and I would walk around and I would imagine them as that person, but like within their own physical shape. And then I would just imagine that the sky was the color that it wasn't, and that the roads were the different colors, and everything was like super psychedelic. And I would project that onto the world. I'd
say that thing's got a bit strange. That must have had a very big effect then on your life then.
Yeah. So then at that point, I was just like seeing everybody as enlightened, fully enlightened and stuff. And it just generated so much goodwill, and just like, even though like, it wasn't like when I would imagine things, they would literally look like that, but like my mind would perceive it looking like that. So it's that weird thing where like I see it, but I don't see it, but it's there because your mind is trying to manifest it. But while on retreat, doing this practice, so I was like carrying this, like I was basically just doing it all the time, like 24/7, just imagining wherever I was this Buddha. Everybody I saw was a specific Buddha. When I was on retreat, I was very angry for some inexplicable reason and very frustrated and just sort of felt like a rabid beast. And at one point when I was sitting, this Buddha appeared to me and was sitting 6 or 7 feet across from me. Like I literally felt their presence.
Okay.
And it got really strange because this specific Buddha form is male, but basically what ended up happening, it started shape-shifting and then it merged with me. Like there was this very tangible sense of this Buddha merging with me. And then it led to like a very powerful, there's these states called jhanas in Buddhism where like deep absorption states. And I saw like my entire field of vision was white light. So at that point, that's when I was like, oh, magic is real, because I had this very tangible sense of this Buddha being in the room. It wasn't just like, oh, like I'm just imagining that.
Yeah. No question, just actually happened kind of a thing.
Right. Because, you know, like when people are skeptical about magic and like, oh, well, didn't you just see that? Or you think you saw that? Like you imagined it? Like, no, there's a difference. It's like, it's no different than like somebody across the room is there. You don't question that they're there.
So would that have been your becoming invincible moment in the kind of Gordon White sense of things? You know, the bit where you can't go back to the way you were, like that's it, magic exists. There's no, you know, you can't pretend it doesn't now.
Yeah, I would even say, even before cessation, like when I started seeing that stuff was becoming really weird and like malleable, that's when it was. But right. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Because as I was reading about when I was learning about the imaginal work, I was also starting to learn about magic as well. Side by side. Yeah. So like I would read a lot of the standard gateway texts, you know, like Liber Null and, you know, like high magic. Yeah. Because I didn't know anything about magic at that point. I didn't know what Kabbalah was. I didn't know about chaos magic. I didn't know about Golden Dawn. I didn't know about Aleister Crowley at all. There was just never any reason for me to know about them. Because because my heritage is I'm half Asian, so I always had like this Asian leaning, you know, like all these other things. So then like the Western stuff was totally new to me, which was really fun to learn about at the time and just totally experiment along the way.
So is that then the magic kind of stuff then at that point? Did that get you towards say the Alan Chapman and the Magia stuff, or did that happen differently, or how did you end up? I assume you ended up around Wiser by Design, or was it previous? Was it So how did you get to Alan Chapman then? I suppose that's the question.
So yeah, basically, you know, I had a voracious appetite at the time to try everything, whether it was Buddhism and then magic. I just started trying all the books that I could find. You know, so basically, it was like, okay, what are the top occult books? You know, you type that into Reddit. What comes up, you know, and then, you know, people dump like these huge drive, you know, all these huge files that have like hundreds of books. Yeah, no one has ever read, ever. Nobody's ever read, right, you know. So I tried a bunch of different stuff, like Initiation into Hermetics was one that I really liked for a long time.
That's Jason Newcomb, isn't it?
No, that's the...
Franz New Hermetics. Yes.
But yeah, Newcomb he's inspired by Barton.
Yeah. Bard is very dry, though, isn't he? He's quite...
He's super dry. But there was something about it that I liked because it reminded me of The Mind Illuminated. It's like very self-driven.
Right, yes.
And because a lot of the exercises were very much like things that I was already practicing, like body breathing, for example. I was like, oh, okay, I can... And I actually had some really awesome stuff happen when I was doing Franz Barton. Like, he does, like, elemental breathing. I remember one day I was in a sauna and I was doing water breathing and I had goosebumps in a dry sauna and felt chill. I was like, holy shit, that's amazing. Nice. So then one of the books was advanced magic for beginners. So,
the infamous,
it's like the infamous, right? So when I remember reading it, I was like, who is this grumpy old man? Like the tone of it, he just seems like this salty dog.
It's like I recently put up a meme of Alan on Facebook, and it was like, the 5 steps how to do magic, and everyone was like, fine with the magic bit, but no way is that Alan Chapman. He's a grumpy old man. It's not this kind of 30-year-old mid-30s, whatever the photo was taken. He really is old salty dog energy in advanced magic for beginners.
He was just like super snarky, and because I love comics, and so like it's some of like the writing reminded me of like the Vertigo writers,
sure, like
Grant Morrison, so like because I'm not usually exposed to like the to the Europeans that much, so it was like the language and the slang and stuff was like really humorous to me, so I found it quite endearing. So then it was like, oh well, what's this guy up to now? And then, I would check every once in a while, and then that's when I discovered that he was doing Wiser by Design. I didn't really practice a lot of this stuff in advanced magic for beginners, just because I had already been messing around with chaos magic prior. But when I saw that he was doing Wiser by Design, I was really intrigued, because I was like, oh, well, he's moved away from, magic, like chaos magic style practices. And then he was concerned about establishing a Western wisdom tradition. And I was like, well, what even is a Western wisdom tradition? And that's
so you went from advanced magic beginners to Wiser, so there was no, like, no Baptist Head books in between, or anything. So it was a huge jump from chaos magic to the Western magical tradition, awakening type things. Whereas, if you had been following, I suppose, along, it's probably not as big as a jump, although it's still quite a jump, I suppose.
Yeah, so for me, like, I would say, like, magical practice was, like, extracurricular activities where I was still primarily concerned about finding a right Buddhist teacher. So I was like, okay, obviously Vajrayana is the way I want to go. I have to try to find a teacher in that way. And so for 2 years, I was practicing with a modern Vajrayana school called Dharma Ocean. But just the whole time, like, I was just never very satisfied with, I would see all these teachers, and so I would just try to hope that I would find somebody, because what I noticed when I was practicing magic was, weird stuff would happen. It was really cool. But personally, it sort of felt like I was like treating magic like a prostitute. Like, I would just be like, I want this thing. I demand that I have it. And it just started to feel really hollow to me, despite the fact that, like, clearly reality was magical. And so basically I began to appreciate the fact that, like, oh, Vajrayana is the magical Buddhist, lineage. I'm going to go with that. And basically my magical practice was, I wanted to become more awakened, and I also wanted to help people awaken and also just contribute to a more positive world. So all that energy, so I would do different magical stuff, but it never became primary, although it was still very much a part of my life. So I guess, my sense of extracurricular is still like, whoa, that's still maybe heavy duty,
Yeah, I suppose it's hard. It's a hard kind of way to delineate the magic from your life, because you start being magic rather than doing magic. And, so where it's like, people say, oh, have you done much magic recently? Because, well, I haven't done many sigils, if that's what you're asking. But, like, my approach is very magical, which I think is what you're kind of pointing at there.
Yeah. And I actually remember reading at some point, like, Grant Morrison talked exactly to that. Because, like, Invisibles was, like, his hyper sigil.
Yeah.
But then at some point, like, he was just like, I don't need to do magic. I am magic. And that idea, even early on, was like, that resonates with me personally. And a lot of people treat magic as as an art. So, like, they use it as, like, artistic expression. So, like, there's lots of things, magical practice is very broad. But at some point it stopped making sense to separate it as, like, this explicit thing I would do versus how things already are.
Yeah. And that's kind of, I suppose, in a sense, the backbone of, living in a magical universe or world or existence or whatever. So just getting back to the Wiser, did you when you found it, were you like, here it is, this is what I'm looking for? Or was it, were you skeptical? What was your kind of initial thoughts about the whole thing?
So a lot of it was like, it was not, this was it just yet. It was very much like, I love a lot of what's going on. I actually quite liked the website, and I liked a lot of how it was structured. I thought it was interesting, and the practices were different. So like, I very much, when I heard about the Holy Guardian Angel initially in my studies, like, oh, that seems really awesome. It really resonated with me. And so when I first encountered the Beloved practice in that manifestation, I was like, oh, this is sort of scratching that itch.
Yeah.
But, the thing is, like, at the time, dialectic practice was so complicated. And, and it really sucked that it was really tethered to the website.
Yeah.
And I just never really felt super confident that I was doing it well. And fire practice felt very familiar to me because of Buddhist practice, because eventually I started getting into like Mahamudra and Dzogchen. And so the fire practice felt very familiar, but the analogy was still unique. And so I appreciated that. But when I was learning the Beloved, that form of the Beloved practice, it just felt like a mouthful, and it wasn't really connecting to the heart. It just felt like I was saying a bunch.
It was a mantra and beads at that point, was it? If I'm remembering correctly,
like it was. It was my pure sense of self. I forget what it was, but it just never really gelled for me. And he would talk about cosmological practice, and it made no sense to me at the time. So at some point, I was really struggling within Dharma Ocean because it wasn't turning out the way I was hoping it would. And then Alan was talking about all of these things that nobody would talk about, like transmission, for example. Like he had all those Wiser Q&A videos, and I was just like, he is talking about things that nobody else is talking about. Like, for example, there was one video where he's like, why does it take some people more to awaken than others? And he was like, it's not happening if it's not happening. Like, it doesn't matter if you're clocking X amount of time on the odometer. And that was the whole thing with shadows. Like, you could think you're a good practitioner, but in reality, like, nothing's happening. And then that exacerbates people's level of frustration because they expect things should have happened sooner.
Yeah. But I've done 10,000 hours. Why aren't I an awakened being?
That's the level of mastery. 10,000 hours. That's it. A lot of people have that. A lot of people have that attitude. And
sure, and understandably, given we have the kind of thing of that. If you haven't achieved something, it's because you haven't put the right effort in. That is kind of a big Western thought, I suppose. It doesn't help when it comes to meditation and awakening.
Oh, not at all. And that attitude, I've seen a lot of people, because for a while on Stream Entry, I would sort of act as like a spiritual friend for people who needed help. And I would just see like people would get so stuck and they just would turn up the effort. And that just often makes it worse, like the effort, because all this Western notions of success get kind of tied into it, and it's it can be very, very bad. So basically at one point with Wiser, I was like, you know what, like I'm super into what Alan is talking about. I really like what's going on. But at the point there was like 4 or 5 different stages of the curriculum, and fourth was forthcoming.
And
so basically, like, I was waiting. I was like, okay, I'm going to stick a pin in this. I'm going to wait until the 4th one comes out, and we'll see if that will sort of tie everything together. What ended up happening is Wiser by Design did not complete, but then Magia came out. And then at that point, I was like, yes, this is it. Which was very surprising to me because I was like doggedly trying to find the teacher for me in Buddhism. And I met a ton of people and I tried a bunch of different things, like the Diamond Approach, for example, and found some local Sufi orders and stuff, and really was hoping to find something. But it was just such a pain in the ass, man. Like, it just was such a painful thing. And I was also confused. I was like, why is there so much of a struggle here? It just feels so ridiculous to struggle over this thing, because early on I felt so like self-sufficient. I would be like,
yes,
you know,
oh yeah,
I was like, I had the training book. I was, you know, at some point, like, you need more help, you know what I mean, from people. And I was just very frustrated because I would meet people and I'd be like, I don't know if you can really offer me what I'm looking for.
And was it mostly that the people you found didn't have the answer you wanted? Like they just didn't have the expertise in it. Yeah.
And some people had the expertise, like they were obviously very awakened, but it's like falling in love, you know, like finding your teacher's like falling in love, where like, you know, you can, this person's attractive, or like they can check off all these boxes on your like ideal list, but there's still that something that's not there.
Yeah.
So I was very fortunate because living in Seattle, you know, there's a lot of options. There's always teachers coming through. There's all these people around that are doing stuff, and it's very interesting. And despite that was what was frustrating, because I was like, this should be satisfying.
Yes, yeah.
This should be scratching the itch. But I was just getting increasingly fed up. And then when Magia came along, it just was like, I've come home.
Right. Okay.
And so, you know, we've talked about the storm and just wanting to come home. And
sure.
At that point, the sense of coming home was very immature. Like, it was very undeveloped. But at some point, I was just like, you know, like, however this is going to unfold, I don't need to grind anymore, you know, grind over the search, like let go of this aspect of the seeking, you know. And it was really surprising.
I suppose there's a bit in the beginning of it where it mentions there's going like, you know, this kind of acknowledgement that you found it, but you don't really understand it. And I think it definitely, I knew that, you know, and it took me a while to kind of get around it. But I think some people I've talked to, when they get to the storm, which is it's a story within near the end of the audio teachings, or the teachings in general, when they get to that line, you know, the wanting to come home thing, is that's I think for me anyway, definitely right. Well, here I am. That this is pointed, big hand coming down, pointing right into my heart, going, "This is it."
Totally. Yeah, and I remember, you know, initially, because, you know, Alan wasn't very available during Wiser, but I remember like he was like basically non-existent. So then he started to become more available, and I just felt super awkward, like, will you be my teacher? And like this fear of rejection and like looking like a dummy, you know, because like with all the other teachers, like I just didn't feel self-conscious, but now I was like I felt like an awkward teen. And, you know, he's like, well, do you feel home or not? Like, am I your teacher or not? You know, like, so it just, I was like, oh, that's an interesting way to phrase it, you know? And so then it took a life on its own, which even within the last year and a half since the teaching came out there's been a lot of growth and a lot of things that have changed since I started engaging with it. And so it was super surprising because, like, you know, the silent knowing takes you through this journey, and I like had this specific idea of what I wanted and what I was looking for. And as I've come to learn who the ancestors of this lineage are, I'm like, I'm not familiar with most of these people at all, you know? Right. And so it's this weird thing where I'm just like, you know, it's like this, your family, but you don't know them, you know? Yeah. So it's just this weird thing, like, very unpredictable, very unusual, and very amusing for that reason.
So Magia, is that like where you're firmly centered in, or are you keeping a couple of other practices in your back pocket, or what's your practice today look like?
Yeah, so basically, you know, it's funny because I think sometimes people come to this point and they're just like, I've done enough experimenting. Like, I did so many different things, and, you know, so many novel experiences arise out of that. But after a while, like, it loses its appeal to just do those things for the sensationalism, I guess, or just for entertain, you know, recreational aspects of magic. And for me, at this point, it's all I do. It's like basically the 3 practices and the binding practice are all I do. Because, like you said, the clarity of magical reality, that we are magical. I remember listening to a Ramsey Duke's interview on Rune Soup where he very much talks about this idea. Yeah, I forget which interview it was, but just like at some point you don't really need to do magical acts in this explicit way, because if your intention and your mind are leading the way, that's all that you need. So, like things like writing or setting intentions, I see them as magical acts, or prayer, like, so nothing like, and that's why initially I was drawn to chaos magic, because although it would be super fun to like dress up and play wizard, there's a part of me, like the minimalist in me, is like, oh man, that requires too much setup. Too lazy to fucking get these ingredients, or like, and living in the city, it's hard to have like a remote space to do things,
I think like the thing, you become more and more, it's the idea, as we were saying, that magic just becomes what you do. But I have noticed that kind of when you sort some of your stuff out, your shadow stuff, or your the places where you're being an asshole, or your shadows in the Magia sense, that certain things in your life kind of seem to click in a different way that wouldn't have clicked before. And so in a sense, the necessity of things that you would normally may have from a chaos magic point of view, do a sigil for or working for, it's not as relevant because the path is a bit clearer or something, that you don't have to force it as much. I think that's probably a good way of expressing it, that but it's not going with the flow, man. Either,
totally. Yeah, so that's a very accurate way of describing it, for sure, because it's like, like in Magia speak, it's like, oh, we usually come at things from an absence. So like if you're trying to cast a sigil, or you're doing a specific magical ritual, you're hoping to actualize something. But if something is operating underneath that is sabotaging you without your knowing it, when you have a persistent sense of lack and frustration because you're like, okay, yeah, I got the $10 or whatever, like, it's like, okay, well, now what? I always had this feeling of like, now what? Now what? Like I would do this sigil. Now what? And
wait till the next disaster. Right. Okay.
Yeah, and it just felt kind of exhausting, and I just felt sort of lazy, and then when I was doing divination, I would just be like, okay, like I there's a part of me that would feel like a schmuck for doing divination, because I'd be like, okay, like I'm just trying to get an answer so that I'll feel okay about a situation.
I'm looking for the answer that I want, really. So, a lot of the time.
And when you interact with oracles in that way, they know. And so like, it's like the diminishing returns. It's like, it's just sort of like, I'm done with you, like, you're like, like, I don't need to, you're not getting a message of some sort, like there's just that lack of charge or like aha-ness that when you sort of treat divination that way, it's like, I'm trying to sniff up these trees, but there's nothing to find here. So when I've done bindings that are successful, they've actually had very intense magical ramifications. Like reality, like something really shifts and things change, and weird synchronicities would come up, and I'd be like, holy crap, I sort of imagine like when you bind a shadow, it's like if you imagine like a string with a ton of knots on it, all of a sudden it's like the knots undo themselves, and then it's like
it's a very interesting thing, and I don't know if it's the same for you, but I found that the bindings are in one particular area, say they're to do with relationships or whatever it is, but then you notice that it has an effect on your work, and you go, but they don't seem connected, and you go, oh well, they are in some way, that it seems to be a whole, I suppose it's not all separate things, it's one big system, and I mean, of course we know that too, but it's an interesting one, that it's how the thing is, you said, the underlying current of what you have, you can do all the sigils you want, but if ultimately underneath it you think you're a piece of shit who doesn't deserve money, wealth magic's probably not going to work too well for you, so you should deal with these issues. And but that's a kind of a thing that what I was really drawn to in the Magia stuff and the Wiser was that in most magic things and most magic kind of teachings, there's never really let's try to be better people section. It's all about, how to get your ex-boyfriend back, or, how to curse your enemies, or how to become, rich and famous, or whatever.
Yeah.
Not quite as bad as that, but it's a lot about getting the things. Whereas, like, how, let's try not to be an asshole anymore. What about that? Which is, I think, is the most important bit, because it answers all the other bits, the lack.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, I couldn't put it better. I mean, the one thing that you said earlier about, like, you do a binding and it seems like it's about a specific problem, but then you realize, like, oh, all these other things. All of a sudden, like, I would do a binding and then some sort of unrelated situation would avail itself and be like, oh, wow, this is now becoming resolved. So for me, like, really fraught relationships with my siblings, for example, have miraculously corrected themselves,
right?
And it's like unbelievable, because if you present this practice to people, you're like, how is that magic? Like you can't really appreciate the effect it has until you do it. Like, you can sort of, if you look at the way it's structured, you're like, oh, okay, I can see how it's helpful, because you see something, you see this pattern of behavior that sabotages you. Okay, I can sort of understand how that leads to, like, an understanding of the situation, which is all true.
Yeah.
But then the actual magical effect of doing binding and how that manifests in all these really unpredictable ways is really mind-blowing.
Yeah.
And very satisfying. Yeah. So everything that you said was really on point for me as well. So you sort of get drawn forward through, you take care of this thing on its own time, and then this next thing comes up and it sort of just works itself out.
Yeah.
And that's the, the thing, like, you're talking about, like, the being a good person, like, as you work these situations out, it's like, especially during these times, it's like, you can say, oh, I want material wealth and I want security, but real security is having the support of your friends. Like, what if something bad happens to you during these times? Like, you can't, that sort of wealth is priceless, to have the support of your loved ones and your friends. And when you need it, much more than, just a stack of cash can be. What good will a stack of cash can be, in the apocalypse?
Well, that's it. And I mean, the mini apocalypse, I suppose, we're going through has really shined a light on things like that. And I hope, like, I was very kind of optimistic that this would be a great kind of learning period for us all. And then you come to the kind of now and you go, well, maybe no one's learning anything. But certainly for me, it's, really been a testament to things like that. What is wealth? And wealth isn't money in the bank. Wealth is, is your friends, is your support, is, even your own ability to survive something. It's your resilience and things like that. Money in the bank's nice too, don't get me wrong.
Oh, totally. And that's the funny thing too, is, like, historically in my life, very unhealthy relationship to money and debt. And then, a lot of it, is being in an ideal, partnership now, and just having a really good partner now, and having an alignment there. But, my situation, what's funny about coronavirus and stuff, there's been lots of challenges, of course, emotionally, the social isolation. But on the other hand, I have been doing very well, like, and, having a lot of financial security, actually doing way better. I'm actually doing better during the pandemic
cool.
than I ever have.
Yeah.
And it's not like I'm not even doing a new job or anything, but, like, something shifts.
Yeah.
And then I feel really taken care of. So there's something that Alan talks about. He talks about, through practice, when we bring the divine into the center, then our life unfolds from that. And that's sort of become really obvious to me in practice. Like, I don't need to worry about all these problems. If I just engage life and have a practice, it's going well, and I'm just so grateful for that. It's really amazing to really taste the benefit of that, and see how powerful magic is.
Sure,
and the specific style of magical practice, I think, is unprecedented in some way.
Yeah, I think so too.
I think an interesting thing that you just mentioned was, we would hope that during this time where people have more time to themselves to bake bread or, exercise in their living room, that this would be a moment to contemplate. But unfortunately, that hasn't necessarily panned out in the ways when we look at social media and we look at the news. When I think about practicing magic, it's also just seeing the magical effects and understanding how things work. So, for example, in a world where, let's say like in a Western world where people don't appreciate the power of their speech and the power of silence, they'll just blab away, on Twitter, on Instagram, on TikTok, on Facebook, on whatever. People will just blab and blab and blab and get into fights with people. And I see that as like an expression of magic because, the power of the word, language is very powerful and potent. And so when people are recklessly using their power that they're unaware that they actually even have, it explains why there's so much agitation, because it's basically like this battlefield, right? And people are just throwing magic missiles all over the place, and, things are exploding this way and that way. But there's a price to be paid, and that's where I'm hopeful, because when people are noticing like, oh, there's all these studies now, like social media makes you depressed, or people are finding themselves trying to disembed themselves from the
hive mind,
the hive mind. There's something that feels wrong.
Yeah.
And if we say that's a silent knowing, it's like, oh, look, the silent knowing is articulating like, hey, this is, despite our addiction to these things, these malevolent forces that are, commodifying us, it's like something is saying no. And that's where I'm sort of hopeful, despite the fact that it looks pretty awful in a lot of ways right now. But some awareness of at least respecting the power of language, whether we determine that it's magical or not, and the real powerful effect that has, I think is pretty important.
I think there's an element in it, though, going back to what you said about divination and treating oracles in a kind of a flippant way, where to the point where it diminishes the power and the efficacy of, that kind of thing. I think that is also going to start playing out in the speech and the spell and the emanation as a magical kind of missile. I think people will have, and you can see it in some places that, that people don't seem to understand that, their opinion isn't truth, that. But like it's, I don't think we're quite there yet, but there's definitely, the signs are being, they're there to see, if you want, like that we're on the kind of, the trajectory is, it's about to tip down. And I can imagine, I don't know if it's going to be like the destruction of social media or anything like that. I don't think it's going to disappear overnight. But I think there'll definitely be some sort of new approach to it, or I'm hopeful there'll be some sort of new approach to it, because people are getting very kind of sick and tired, literally, of the experience. And that, again, come back to the Magia thing of getting the opposite of what you look for. It's separating us, it's definitely, it's not bringing us together.
Yeah. And that's the thing too, is like, it repeats, right? So like we have to get the message, right? So like clearly like new studies come out, like the physiological effects, the depression, the fact that, more people are committing suicide at an increased rate. Like humanity has to answer that, what I mean? At our own peril. And, hopefully we can wise up. Like you said, that you're hopeful that people will wise up, because it just feels bad. It feels wrong, and at some point you can't ignore it. There's the calling to do it, and like you said, it's not gonna go away. But hopefully, my hope is that people will have a better sense of relating to these things on a personal level, whether it's through practice or some sense of appreciating the detrimental effects, or having a more holistic approach. Like if they have a business, like you have to participate. If you're a writer or something. Or some sort of business person, like you have to participate these things, but having healthier boundaries, and then therefore these small tailorings, if you will have a more productive effect. But obviously we don't have any clue how it's going to pan out. So we'll wait and see.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for talking to me. I really, really enjoyed it. It's particularly good for me because you come from, most people I speak to and most people I've talked about magic, get into magic and then get into the kind of insight awakening kind of meditation. Like I've said that at some stage a chaos magician will become a Buddhist. But you started off, I suppose, as the Buddhist and became a chaos magician. So it's an interesting perspective.
Or whatever this Western tradition.
Whatever is the correct name for it.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, and we'll definitely do it again at some point if you're up for it. And
I'd love it. There's there's definitely lots of stuff to talk about. Because like I have talked a lot about the Buddhist stuff. And by virtue of going over one's history, you start at the beginning, and it emphasizes. That when in reality now it's so much different. So
sure, yeah.
I'd love to chat again at some point if you're up for it.
Oh yeah, we definitely will. Okay, well, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Tommy. Take care.